Napoleon Bonaparte conquered most of Europe. He beat Austria, he beat Prussia, he beat Russia twice actually before 1812. By December of that year, he was leading the largest army ever assembled in European history. 600,000 soldiers. The greatest military mind of his era at the absolute peak of what any event meant. And he walked straight into the worst military disaster in modern history. Not because of Russia's winter, not because Russia's army was stronger, not because of bad luck or bad maps or any of the things history textbooks want to reach for. He lost because of something that happens inside every human brain when things have been going well for too long. A mistake so ordinary that you've probably made a version of it this week, maybe yesterday. This is what happened and why it matters more than you think. To understand what broke Napoleon, you have to feel how long nothing had broken him. By 1812, he'd essentially been undefeated for over a decade. That's not a loose approximation. It's generally hard to find the loss. Austerlitz in 1805 is still studied in military academies as close to a perfect battle as anyone has managed. Prussia, he finished in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. He redrew the map of Europe so many times that his cartographers probably stopped being surprised. He was 42, and based on the evidence available to him, he had reasonable grounds to think that he was the greatest military commander who had ever lived. Here's the uncomfortable part. He might have been right. But something had been quietly shifting inside his thinking, and it started with what looked, from the outside, like a completely sensible decision. Russia had been an ally. Then Russia started trading with Britain again, which violated Napoleon's continental system. His economic blockade meant to squeeze Britain into submission. So Napoleon decided to teach Russia a lesson. The logic was clean. Show up with enough force, and Russia flinches. It had worked on everyone else. Austria flinched, Prussia flinched, the whole of Western Europe had, at various points, flinched. What the logic didn't account for was what a decade of being right had done to the man running it. There's a finding in psychology that's been replicated so many times it's almost boring at this point. Humans are structurally overconfident. When researchers ask people how certain they are about factual answers and then check whether they're actually right, the gap is consistent. Someone who says I'm 90% sure is right around 70% of the time, not 90. 70. And that's for normal people, in normal circumstances, with no particular track record of success to lean on. The effect gets worse the more you've won. Every victory runs through your brain as kind of confirmation. You were confident, things worked out, so the confidence was warranted. Your brain files this away and turns up the baseline for next time. Not dramatically, just a small recalibration. A little less doubt, a little more certainty that you know how things go. Do that enough times across enough victories and you end up with something researchers call poor calibration. You're no longer accurately measuring the distance between what you know and what you don't. The gap is there, but you stop feeling it. Napoleon, by 1812, had essentially stopped feeling it. He planned for a campaign of 3 weeks, 6 weeks at the outside. He didn't bring adequate winter supplies because, in his model of how campaigns worked, this would be over before winter. He'd said similar things before, and he'd always been right. The problem isn't the confidence exactly. The problem is that his brain had stopped generating the scenarios where he wasn't. The Grande Armée crossed into Russia in June 1812. Things were strange almost immediately. The Russian army didn't stand and fight, they pulled back. Burned their own fields, their own villages, their own food stores. Denied the French everything they needed to keep moving. This was a deliberate strategy, and it was a good one. By the time Napoleon reached Smolensk, 2 months in, the situation was already deteriorating. Supply lines ran hundreds of miles back into Poland. Soldiers were dying from hunger and disease, not combat. The army that arrived in Russia was not the army that had left France. A general with a colder view of the numbers might have stopped there, consolidated, reassessed. But Napoleon had already put in too much. 2 months, 500,000 soldiers, the credibility of the entire empire, which ran on the assumption that Napoleon did not back down. And here's where the second trap closes. The sunk cost fallacy is the tendency to keep going because of what you've already put in, even when the rational move is to stop. You know this one. You've lived this one. You stay in the bad job because you've already given it 3 years. You sit through the terrible film because you've paid for the ticket. You finish the meal even though you stopped being hungry an hour ago. Small stakes, same mechanism. What kept Napoleon marching east was the psychological impossibility of writing off everything he'd already spent. And the further he went, the more he'd spent, the more impossible it became. He reached Moscow in September. He expected the Tsar to send officials out to negotiate. He expected the city to surrender. Moscow was empty. And then Moscow was on fire. The Russians burned their own capital, removed the warehouses, the supplies, any reason for the French to stay. And Napoleon, in the Kremlin, in an abandoned city, in a country that wasn't behaving the way countries were supposed to behave, sat there for 5 weeks. He sent diplomatic letters, he waited, he told himself the Tsar would come around. His generals were giving him accurate reports. The army was shrinking, the horses were dying. Every week in Moscow was a week closer to a Russian winter with an army that couldn't survive one. He knew, at some level, what the reports meant. But leaving meant admitting the campaign had failed. And Napoleon's entire psychological structure, not just his strategy, his identity, was built on the premise that he did not fail. He ordered the retreat on October 19th. Winter had already come. Of the 600,000 soldiers who marched into Russia, fewer than 100,000 came back. Napoleon is the extreme version, but the shape of the mistake is everywhere once you start looking. Hitler in 1941, same logic, almost exactly. Invade the Soviet Union in summer, expect a short campaign, ignore the generals raising concerns about timing and supply. He was even told explicitly about Napoleon. His generals referenced it, he dismissed them. Adam Newman at WeWork burned through billions expanding a company whose math didn't work, chasing a vision he was certain would vindicate itself eventually. When investors finally got a clear look at the numbers before the IPO, the company's valuation dropped by about $80 billion. He'd been surrounded by people telling him it was working. He believed them because he needed to. Blockbuster passed on buying Netflix for $50 million in 2000. They left the meeting out of the room. They'd been the dominant force in video rental for long enough that a world where they weren't dominant had generally stopped feeling real to them. None of these were stupid people. Newman is obviously intelligent. The executives at Blockbuster were experienced operators. Napoleon was, by most serious measures, a military genius. Overconfidence doesn't target the incompetent. If anything, it's worse for people who've spent years being right, because those years are the evidence that the brain uses to justify more confidence. Competence and bad calibration aren't opposites. Sometimes they arrive together. I want to be honest about what you can actually do with this information, because Napoleon was overconfident as a standalone lesson isn't worth much. There's a technique used in serious decision-making environments, used at places like Google, used by some of the better venture firms, called a pre-mortem. Before a project launches, you assume it has already failed, completely, embarrassingly. You sit with that assumptions and ask, what actually went wrong? It sounds simple, it is simple. It's also the opposite of how we naturally approach things we care about. Normally, you're building the case for why it will work. You're generating momentum, you're committing. The pre-mortem forces you to run the failure scenarios before the commitment has fully locked in. Napoleon had no version of this. His court was built around confirming his instincts. When generals raised doubts about the Russia plan, they were raising doubts about Napoleon, which was not a safe thing to do. So the doubts stayed quiet, and the plan went forward without anyone seriously working through what a 5-month campaign in winter with stretched supply lines against an enemy willing to burn their own country would actually look like. The harder thing to sit with is this. Overconfidence doesn't feel like overconfidence. From the inside, it feels like clarity, like knowing something the people around you are too timid to admit. Sunk cost doesn't feel like irrationality either. It feels like persistence, like not quitting when things get difficult, which is a quality you've probably been told is a virtue. Both feelings are real. The biases that get you are the ones that feel like your best qualities. That's what happened to Napoleon in Russia. Not stupidity, not cowardice, not bad luck. He was too experienced to see what he couldn't see. Of 600,000 soldiers, fewer than 100,000 came home. Not because of Russia's winter, because of what was already happening in his mind before he even crossed the border. Hope you enjoyed the video and see you next time.